Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for standing by, and welcome to today's presentation, The Future of Work and Jobs. Your moderator today is Anya Kamenetz, contributing writer with Fast Company. I would now like to turn the conference over to Anya.
Hello. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you to all of you who I assume are waiting out the final hours of your pre-long weekend, and I'm glad that you chose to spend them with us. I think it's going to be a really great discussion. And I personally have a lot of questions for Glen Hiemstra. He is a futurist, the founder and CEO of Futurist.com, which is a boutique consulting company in many different sectors. And he basically pulls together information to help people think about the future. And there are lots of different questions that he gets, but he was mentioning on our pre-call that the future of work is one of the most popular areas that people are curious about, the future of work and jobs when they're thinking about the future. So Glen's going to give a short presentation. I'm going to chime in with my questions. We're going to have some back and forth. And please feel free to enter your own questions in the Q&A box, and we're going to try to handle as many of those as we can. Thanks.
Okay. This is Glen Hiemstra, and let me say just a couple other things about my background and tell you about how the program is going to work. First of all, I've been at the job of being a professional full-time futurist for a little over 2 decades, a long time now, after an early career in higher education. Back when I was in higher education, I was studying how just before the internet was starting up, I was studying how computer networks would change human communication when they went nationwide and global. So that really got me done thinking about the future, and ultimately is the reason that I own Futurist.com, because I was learning sort of what was coming before a lot of other people did. So I simply registered Futurist.com before anybody else did. That's how I own it. And of course, it's been a great piece of real estate for me as a futurist. The question that I get asked by everybody who calls and wants either a presentation or a consultation tends to be something like this. They say, well, we look at the future all the time, or we look at the future not all that often, but this time we would like to look a little further into the future, further ahead. We'd like to look 10 years, 20 years. So typically I'm working with people who want to look at the very long term. Over the years, one of the big questions has been, what's the future of work? What's the future of jobs? And when we do a little analytics on what search terms bring people to Futurist.com or to a site like Futurist.com, the future of jobs is one of the biggest ones. So thank you to Fast Company for hosting this. And I see we have well over 100 people in, so I'm eager to hear what people are interested in. I have prepared a slide deck, and I'm going to use it just a little bit, and perhaps a little strange. There's about 20 slides in, and I'm going to click through and talk for a couple of minutes here to introduce the way I think about jobs and work. And then I'm just going to stop, and we'll see what kind of questions, either from Anya or that are coming in from those of you who are participating in the webinar. And then I might bounce around among the slides. Although it's a linear deck, it's a little hard to bounce around in it. I will probably bounce back and forth a little bit and pull up an image or two as we go on it. So therefore, I may not get through the whole deck. So that's the way it's going to go. The picture that you see now is an old agricultural picture, of course, and I use this to tell a little story, which I frequently tell. It takes place just a little over 100 years ago, when my father's parents, so my paternal grandparents, immigrated from Holland to the state of Montana in the United States. They were about 19 and 20 years old. And they came to Montana dreaming of being big wheat farmers, and they tried to do that for about 15 years or so until they sort of gave up, and they headed for Oregon, but a truck broke down. The truck they were driving broke down just outside of Boise, Idaho, and so they ended up settling in Idaho. And my grandfather then eventually worked in farming a little bit, and then worked in sugar beet factories, and eventually moved to Portland and worked in shipbuilding during World War II until he retired after that. So he saw the world. They saw the world move from a very agricultural era, even though the Industrial Revolution was underway when they were moving here in around 1910, that is, moving to the States. But they really saw the invention of jobs as probably everybody on this call thinks of jobs. Prior to about 1910, most people did not have a job. They worked, but most people were self-sufficient farmers or small shopkeepers or that kind of a thing. And not that many people went to work for somebody else and got paid for doing so. It's really interesting when you look back at how recent the concept of a job is. And my grandparents saw all of this change, and it changed actually fairly rapidly as the final industrial revolution was underway at the beginning of the 20th century. By the mid-1920s, when they were moving from Montana to Idaho, we were well past that final industrial revolution and into the idea that everybody would go to work in factories and offices and so on. And the farming population here in the United States, of course, was shrinking very rapidly. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that this has not been an even development all around the world in terms of when this happens, but the whole world has been in this process for the last century. And that thinking about that then causes me to think about the difference between work and a job. So if we think about what work is, the way I define it is what we actually do to stay alive. We grow things, we make things, we trade things, we run things, and so on. And work has existed for as long as human beings have existed. But most of the time, people have done this just in a sense, kind of paying themselves. And the concept of a job was literally kind of invented during the Industrial Revolution, I think. Now, you go back in ancient history, and sure, people were building pyramids, and they weren't doing that for themselves, and they were doing all kinds of things for other people, but it didn't have the definition of a job like you and I think of a job. Excuse me just a second, I'm going to clear my throat. The job is how we make a living based on what we do for work. And as I was saying, before the 20th century, few people had these jobs. So here's a very careful definition of a job, but it really fits what we think of when we think of jobs, I think. And that is, a job means that you go to work for somebody else. You do work that you're largely instructed to do. You do it for a set amount of time each day. And in exchange for that, you are given your living. You are paid a wage, and in more recent times, you're given some benefits, typically retirement benefits and health care benefits, although as we know here in the United States, at least in the last 10 or 15 years, both retirement benefits and health care benefits have been in the process of disappearing from the job. But that's the way we think of a job. You go to work for somebody else, you get paid for doing something, there's a very fixed time for doing it, and it's quite clear that that is all in the process of changing. So what is happening, and has been happening at a more and more rapid clip in the last 15 years, is work is not disappearing, but the job, as we thought of it in the 20th century, is disappearing, and that has led to a lot of interest in the future of jobs. Will there be jobs? But the answer to that is there won't be jobs in the way that we have thought about them, but there will be lots and lots of work to do. We've got 7 billion people on the planet, soon more than that, and it takes a lot of work to enable that many people to live. So then how does the concept of jobs then match up with the work that actually has to happen? And that's a subject that interests me a lot, and a way to summarize it is with two more slides. If you look at the way society was organized in the 20th century, it's kind of a complicated slide. The industrial society began to change the agricultural society, and it changed it quite radically. And it changed essentially how we make things, buy things, grow things, sell things, manage things, how we travel, how we communicate. It changed the home. It changed how we solve kind of large social problems, moving from private solutions to government solutions, although more recently people have been trying to move back to more private solutions. It invented the schoolhouse and the idea that everybody would go to a place to learn what they needed to learn. It invented the idea of retirement, but essentially invented the idea of the job. But now we're in this kind of post-industrial society that I call an innovation economy. And again, and it's driven largely by the Internet and the globalization of everything. And we're once again reinventing how we make things, buy things, sell things, grow things, manage things, how and when we travel, how and when we communicate. All of that is being changed again. And that means our homes are changing. The idea of learning only in a school is obviously changing. We're at the end of retirement as classically defined. And jobs are being replaced by what Peter Drucker some years ago was the first that I know of to label the stint. So work will still exist in the future, but jobs will be replaced by the stint to a very large degree. And we can talk more about what that means. But let me stop there and see what kind of questions are coming up. Essentially, what I've organized the slides to do is to talk a little bit about what's the kind of the nature of this new stint-based work. And then second, what is the what is the situation with how we're being paid for what we do, and then finally, what are the new jobs that are kind of on the horizon? Those who make predictions about such things, what do they say the jobs of the future are? So, sort of, what's the nature of work? How are we being paid? And what are the new jobs? Is how the slides are organized. But let me stop and see what questions there are. And my screen is frozen. I don't know if people can hear me.
Oh, we can hear you fine, Glenn.
Okay, fine. It looks like Anya's screen is frozen. So let me see if I can see some of the questions. As Anya was going to handle that, and it looks like she got frozen out. I'm sure she'll come back in. Would you please share the entire slide deck? Yes, I'll try to do that. Is the stint the same as a gig? How does automation or robotics play a role in this? Well, let me define what a stint is to begin with. A stint, and I'll get back up to that. So a stint is essentially like a gig, yes. So a stint is, and many people are experiencing this wherever you are, that it looks like this. You go to work for somebody else doing a classic job, and you do that for 2 years, and then your job is downsized away, or the company goes out of business, or it's merged with somebody else, and that job is gone. So then you decide that you're going to try to be a sole proprietor consultant for a little while, maybe with a couple of other people, and you start up your little business, and you do that for about 18 months, and then you figure out that doesn't work so well for you, or you're not making enough money. So you hear about this project that you could go do for a company, and the project is going to last somewhere between 12 and 18 months. And at the end of the project, then everybody is through, and so you go do that project as a contractor for a while, and then you go take another job, and then that job is downsized away, and so on. So you're going from stint to stint to stint as you conduct your work life, and I think that very much is the nature of what jobs are going to look like. That is what work is going to look like as we go through the future. Products have a shorter life cycle, companies have a shorter life cycle, services have a shorter life cycle, and so on. And so that means that we will more and more move from stint to stint. Now that's different from saying, and futurists have been predicting this for a very long time, they're saying things like, have been for a long time, where you're going to have 7 jobs in your lifetime or 10 jobs in your lifetime. But what they're really saying is you're going to move from stint to stint. The core of what you do, whether that's kind of around engineering or around software management or around organizational development or around teaching, whatever it might be, that you might change that once or twice or maybe even 3 times in a lifetime, but it's much more likely that you'll sort of discover something that you're good at, that you like to do, and then you'll do that in a series of stints over the years, rather than kind of going to work for one company or one organization and assuming you're going to be there for a very long time getting salary and benefits. That appears to be going away. So that's what I mean by stint-based work. And Peter Drucker was saying in the 1990s that by about now, it is the second decade of the 21st century, a majority of people would be essentially working at stints, and a minority of people would be working at classic jobs. I don't know how to calculate those percentages, but it's very clear. Particularly the younger you are, the more likely it is that you're working in a stint-based series of stints rather than in a classic job, and more people actually want to do that, and it means you have responsibilities for learning on your own and keeping up with things that are different from when you have a job. So Anya, are you back in? Okay.
Anya's not yet back in, unfortunately.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it. That's too bad. So that's the definition of a stint. Let's talk about another question that's popped up from Armando, and that is, how does automation and robotics play a role in this shift? And it does play a significant role. At the Fast Company site on the internet called Fast Coexist, where there's this Futurist forum that I'm a part of, there's been a couple of things written recently on the impact of robotics on jobs. One can actually come up with a scenario. It's a little bit far-fetched, and it's a little bit science fiction-y, I think. But you can come up with a scenario where it's a possible future that robots, smart machines, and so on will be able to produce so many goods at such a cheap price that fewer and fewer people will be needed to produce everything that we need. And so you can come up with actually a relatively plausible, I think it's still a little bit far-fetched, but a relatively plausible future, a decade, 2 decades, 3, 4 decades from now, in which most of the things that need to get produced, and I'm being careful using the word things that need to get produced, can in fact be produced by machines or by smart robots. And then the question is, so what would everybody do? And clearly there's been a lot of pressure in the last decade and a half as computing technology in particular has enabled fewer people to do more. And so we talk about, we use that phrase all the time, well, you got to do more with less. Well, in fact, we are doing more with less, and we're doing far more with fewer people. We're being much more productive, and that then leads to the question of, will there be enough stints, not to mention jobs, in the future? My take on that, by the way, is this. I do think that it's more likely that there will be plenty of work to do and a way to pay people for that work in the future than we currently think. I've been around for a little while, and I have lived through 2 significant recessions since the 1980s, and now we're in this 3rd Great Recession. But in the previous 2 ones, I can remember, since I was already beginning to dabble in and then work as a futurist, there was lots of conversation around the idea that we would run out of work, that we were in a new kind of jobless recovery, and there was lots of forecasting going on that the economy would come back, but the jobs would not, and that's what we hear that a lot right now. But each time, new technologies, and particularly the Internet, the rise of the Internet in the 1990s, produced all kinds of new jobs, even jobs that weren't conceived of or hadn't been invented before. And I think it's much more likely when you look at nanotechnology and advances in biotechnology and so on, that we will invent all kinds of new things to do. And before we're through, I'll click to the slide that talks about both sort of routine kinds of new stint-based jobs and the more exotic ones, and we'll take a look at that. So I think that it's much more likely there will be plenty of work to do, but it has to be organized differently than we've been organizing jobs in the late 20th century and even here in the early 21st century. Let's talk. One of the next questions that I saw was the impact of STEM education, a phrase which is very popular here in the States, and it stands for, if you're not familiar with it, for science, technology, engineering, and math, in the sense of, and in fact, the numbers here in the U.S. are there aren't enough people being trained in science, technology, engineering, and math, not enough people majoring in that and choosing to do that, and therefore we're having a shortfall in people qualified to do high-end engineering, high-end in computer, electronics work, and so on. And that leads me to the next slide, which I'll click on right now, and that is that if you want to ask about the nature of the new economy and the nature of the stint-based work, this is a nice summary of it. It was actually some years ago that a Japanese writer named Taiichi Sakaya wrote a book called The Knowledge Value Economy, thus the headline on this slide. One of the best books on the kind of the future of economics and business and society that probably has ever been written. And he's the one who really clarified, for me at least, that in the future, and we're already in this world, the ability of a product or a service or a person to compete depends more and more on your knowledge value. That is, how smart are you? How good is your knowledge? How up-to-date is your knowledge? And one can really see this clearly by comparing cell phones. pick up your cell phone. I'll pick up my iPhone right here. So I pick up my iPhone and I go to and I look at it, but I'm in a phone store and I'm looking at 5 phones on a countertop, and I'm thinking, now which one do I want to buy? And if money is not an object, or if the prices are relatively equal or affordable to me, how will I make that choice? And I'll make that choice based on the following criteria, primarily. I will ask, which of these phones is smarter? Which one has been built by smarter people? Which one has smarter information in it? Which one can hold more smart information? Which one will make me smarter because I use this phone? And then another criteria that Sakaya actually pointed to, which was, which phone will make me look smarter when I take it out of my pocket? That's knowledge value. And we make those kind of choices all the time in the services that we buy and the products that we choose. What does that mean? That means it's what a product or a service knows that really matters. And what that means is that knowledge value needs people who have knowledge, and thus worldwide we have to figure out, and this is true country by country, you have to figure out how to organize communities to provide the opportunity for more and more people to obtain better and better knowledge on a continuous basis. Literally in the U.S., millions of people, literally probably tens of millions of people more, who need to get better education than they have today if you're really going to make it in a knowledge value economy. Let me talk a little bit about one of the most interesting quotations that I've come across in the last couple of years. And it's a very powerful issue in the world of work, and it is, how are we getting paid? And I'll come back to a global perspective on this in a moment. 100 years ago, so when my grandparents were moving here, Henry Ford was building his first Model T, and he got really famous for the final, building the assembly line, but he also got really famous for paying people $5 a day, because he had figured out that he wanted his people to be able to afford the cars that they were building. Very simple notion. And he was a great one for recording and writing down all of his thoughts, and the internet is full of quotations from Henry Ford. And on the screen is one of my very favorite ones. It's a really amazing thing to think about in today's world. And this is what he said: there is one rule for the industrialist, and that is, make the best quality of goods possible at the lowest cost possible, paying the highest wages possible. And so when I'm in front of business audiences, I like to ask, when did we forget this third clause, paying the highest wages possible? Because all around the world, certainly all around the U.S. and all around the world as well, people are focused way too much on paying the lowest wages possible. And that has led to a world which looked like this. Now, this is a survey of men, not women, in the United States. And the reason they chose men, because women were not so much in the workforce as they are now. Back in the 1970s, when this survey was targeted at, but the numbers are about the same for women, except that the wages they get paid, of course, are about 20 to 30% lower than men do. And the wages of college graduates have the same curve, but they're higher because there's a premium for getting a college degree, at least in the United States. But what the charts that you see on the screen ask are two questions. If you had a high school diploma in 1970, how likely is it that you had a job? You remember that old definition of a job, compared to 2010. And then what were you paid in 1970 compared to 2010? The chart is very simple. On the left side, you see if you have a high school degree, you had a 95% chance of being employed. And your average wage in 2010 dollars was $51,000 in the United States. By 2010, this is the depths of the Great Recession, you only had a 75% chance of being employed, and your wage had fallen by half, down to $26,000. So what has happened is we've continued to get more and more productive, but people are being paid less and less and less, and the money is going elsewhere. It's going into very high wages for those at the top. It's going into a lot of retained earnings. It's going into all kinds of things except for wages for people. And that is leading more and more people to ask questions about, how do you then organize work so people get paid enough? Just yesterday, I read a very interesting blog post on it's time for an international minimum wage. And there's a lot of discussion in the United States about increasing the minimum wage in the U.S. The bottom line point is, in a stint-based work world, in a world in which work can be moved anywhere in the world, not just the manufacture of simple things, but the manufacture and even design of more complex things, and even services can be moved around the world now more easily. It's going to be necessary, and in terms of a social political policy, to think about how do we make sure that people get paid enough, because when unregulated, economies tend to drive wages down rather than up. It's the opposite of what people think, but the evidence, the historical evidence, is very clear on this. So we have just a few minutes left. Why don't I skip several slides ahead, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the future of what the jobs of the future are, and then we'll see what last questions there are. 30 minutes turns out to be a very short period of time. My wife likes to tell me I can't even give an introduction to a talk in 10 or 15 minutes. So excuse me, we get asked all the time, so what are the jobs of the future? Well, here is a list of very exotic jobs, and then the next slide, to make sure I have the right ones, are the more routine jobs. Let me start with the more exotic ones. You can find lots of forecasts, lists like this on the internet, but they all actually do make some sense. The question is how many people would be doing these things. But suppose you're really motivated to get a science, technology, engineering, math degree, and you want to get into something new. Well, look at this list: gene farmers. Genetic engineering is actually flying ahead in terms of the ability to understand the human genome, but also crop genomes and animal genomes and so on. And we're really in the early stages of people being able to actually farm with that. Food engineers, bioengineers, brain augmenters, biomedical engineers, spaceport traffic controllers, human-related spacecraft maintenance. You might not know that Elon Musk, the guy who invented the Tesla automobile or is building the Tesla automobile and has a company called SpaceX, his actual dream is to put 1 million people on Mars in the 2030s. And if that happened, yeah, you would be having spaceport traffic control and human-related spacecraft maintenance. Nature conservationists, ethics lawyers, and domestic robot programmers. But if you ask where most of the jobs are going to be, they're a little bit more routine. Dental hygienist. Why would that be on the list? Well, it turns out that we are outliving our teeth. This is very interesting. You go back a couple of thousand years, and the average lifespan was 30 years. And it turns out, without proper care, people's teeth only last for 30 to 40 years, and then they really start to wear out. And so, as you have 7 billion people on the planet, most of whom are capable of living to be 65, 75, 85, 95, even 100 years old, there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done in dentistry. It's really quite interesting when you think of it that way. Human resource specialists. People need to adjust. I was just in a meeting yesterday where somebody was telling me they've just been retained by the Boeing company. Boeing, here in Seattle where I live, is laying off lots of people. What is her job? She's going to go in and teach them how to be entrepreneurs. Biomedical, biotechnology salespersons, lawyers, nuclear and solar power engineers, entrepreneurs. Let me talk about the entrepreneur one just a little bit. I'm going to back up a few slides just so we have a thing that says entrepreneur. This is one of the most interesting numbers that you'll come across, and if you guys will bear with me, I've got about 10 more minutes, and we talked about whether we'd run a little bit long, so I can go for about 10 more minutes. I'm going to say something about this, and then we'll see what additional questions there are. We'll take another couple more questions. This applies to the U.S., and so and I don't know how clearly it applies in Australia or in Europe or other places, but here in the U.S., a friend of mine who actually runs a marketing company here in Seattle, his name is Christian Jacobson. His company's called Boomba Chicken. It's really a clever little name. He was mucking around on the U.S. Census Bureau website, and he discovered the following two numbers. There are about 27 million businesses in the United States. Of those, 22 million are tiny businesses, typically what here in the States we call a sole proprietor business. So it might be one person who might have one part-time worker or two part-time workers, but these 22 million generally have less than 5 people in them. 22 million companies. That's the future. So this person I was in this meeting with yesterday, who just got this little assignment with Boeing, as I was saying, her job is to go in with 1,500 people being laid off and to teach them the assumption that they're making is most of them are going to want to go out and start their own companies rather than try to get another job, remembering how I defined a job at the beginning of the webinar. They're going to say, I'd rather do a stint, and I'd rather try to do it on my own. I'd rather get together with a couple of my friends and start a little engineering services company or a little engineering consulting company, or maybe I'd rather start an internet company, whatever it might be. This is a huge movement in terms of what will the work look like in the future, and it's a tremendous opportunity. It's never been easier anywhere in the world to start your own business because of all the support you can get via the World Wide Web and the ability then to, whatever you're doing, to let the whole world know what that is, and to get support from people all over the world. So this, I think, when we look back from a vantage point of, say, 15 or 20 or 25 years from now, we'll discover that there was a boom in the amount of work and the amount of paid stint-based work over this 10, 15, 25-year period. Work was not going away. Classic jobs were going away, but there was more work than ever to do. But it'll be in this entrepreneurial, more stint-based kind of fashion. So with that, let me. I think we have Anya back on, and why don't we see if you want to pose another question or two. We've got a list to maybe take another 6 minutes or so, if that's okay with you.
Sure. We have a lot of questions about education. So I think we should definitely speak to that and where education is going to go. We also have a lot of questions about, I guess home-based business or working from home, telecommuting, which is fascinating. Okay. And I have a question for you about, you talked about sort of wage reform, but if we foresee that jobs are disappearing, then how is it going to help to work on wages? That's somehow people are going to get.
Okay, that's a good contradiction that you caught in my stuff. But let me save that for the very last. Let me just say a word about education. I just clicked up this picture of an original Apple computer, which is so cute. It's clear that what's happening with schools is that schools are in the process of becoming the boundaries around schools are becoming permeable. I don't think that the idea of going to a college to learn is going to disappear in any kind of rapid time frame, nor do I think we're going to just kind of blow up all the schoolhouses and let everybody learn from home. But what's clearly happening is that more and more of our learning is going to come over the internet, to just say it simply. And so when you're in a schoolhouse, whether that's a K through 12 school as we call it in the States or a university, a great deal of the information gathering is going to come over the internet. And then you might sit with groups of people and a professor talking about what you're learning. And so almost all information transmission is going to be through the internet, and very little of it is going to come by somebody telling you something face to face. So that changes what the role of schools are, what the roles of universities, and what the role of teachers are. As to what to learn, there's a nice little addition that's being done by some people to this STEM education: science, technology, engineering, math, and that includes the arts. If you look at the next a couple of decades, I think more and more people are going to be doing things that are creative. And so if I was starting over again to go to school, I would be really interested in, if I can cope with it, if I'm good enough at it, I would get into science, technology, engineering, math somewhere. I'd probably be interested in getting into space technology, because that's always been an interest of mine. But the other side of me is very artistic, and I would think I might be much more inclined now to go for an artistic career. That is, getting into the production of videos or entertainment of some kind, because the world is paying a lot for that, and I think will pay a lot for that going forward. So those two areas is kind of a real technology emphasis or a real artistic emphasis, I think are two really good ones. And now I've forgotten the other two questions besides yours, which is the contradiction about wages. What were the other two? That was education, and you mentioned two others.
Well, there's one other for sure about telecommuting, and what does this mean for the future of working from home?
Oh, yes. Telecommuting, yeah. You would be if you're young, you'd be really interested to know how many. So I started being a full-time futurist in the 90s. I went to so many conferences on telecommuting, you wouldn't believe it, and how telecommuting was going to change change the world of work and everybody was going to be working from home. Actually, I do think that what happened is that the technology wasn't ready for that yet, and it's still not quite ready. As the internet becomes more visual, as we see in this webinar, and the technology still is relatively crude if you look at the interface that we're using and how it all looks. So you have to time shift, another 10 or 15 or 20 years ahead, when virtually every home, even of modest means, will have like a wall-size screens everywhere. In fact, the walls themselves might become screens, and they'll have built-in cameras. Go to look at the Microsoft House of the Future, or look at what Microsoft said about the Xbox this week. So there will be technological leaps that will make what we think of as the internet more and more three-dimensional and more visual all the time, so that we're sort of living in it all the time. So you don't go online to get and then call up a visual stream. It's just that everywhere you look, you're inside this visual stream all the time. And when that happens, then I think we'll see a growth in what we would define as telecommuting, but it won't be really thought of as telecommuting. It'll just be thought of as working. So today I'm working here, and tomorrow I'm working there, and it's all kind of seamless. I actually have told audiences for a while that I think in the 2020s, the concept of being online and offline will sort of disappear from the language, because we're sort of simultaneously both all the time. There are still advantages to getting together with people face-to-face, and I don't think that's going to disappear even in a three-dimensional, hyper-video world. We'll still be probably more often than not going somewhere to be with people. But a very high percentage of our time, I would say approaching 50% of our time, we won't be doing that. That's kind of how I've been home-based work, but I also had offices. I have an office in Seattle now. I go there a couple of days a week, and then work from home a couple of days a week, and then typically I'm on the road somewhere. And I think that's a very common kind of future for most work. Okay. The last question maybe we should take is yours, and this contradiction between wages, like the idea of an international minimum wage, which I actually do think is needed. I don't know how we would ever promulgate that internationally, but I could see it happening in the European Union. I could see regulations being passed that say if you're going to import clothing from India or Bangladesh or somewhere, you have to pay people a minimum wage. End of story, or else you can't bring that clothing into this country. I could easily see that happening. But there's a contradiction between that and the idea that, well, you're going to get paid a wage, therefore you're in a classic job, and you're working for yourself. Probably the most provocative thinking on this is actually something that goes back to the early 1970s when I was coming out of college. There's an author. I just pulled out his book. I won't hold it up. His name is Byron Reese. He's involved with eHow.com and some other companies. And Byron has written a book called Infinite Progress. Very interesting book. And in it, he sort of resurrects a notion from the early 70s, and it's called the guaranteed minimum wage. Let's suppose you get into a world in which you can produce all the goods and services, and you don't need everybody working to do that. How do people buy food? How do people pay for their housing and so on? And literally the proposal is, and this was actually a proposal in the Richard Nixon administration in the United States, and that is a guaranteed minimum wage. Everybody would literally get a check every year. You would just get a check for X thousands of dollars every year, and then in addition, whatever you earn on your own is in addition to that. It's people can't even believe that that's a realistic idea, but if you really unpack it, there is a way to imagine that being the future, and Byron Reese actually thinks that as the internet and robotics and everything gears up to produce everything, it almost becomes a guaranteed future. A guaranteed minimum wage becomes a guaranteed future. So we'll see about that. The challenge for everybody listening and watching, I think, is to ask two questions. So, if the future of work is really secure, there's always going to be lots and lots of work to do. But you may not be able to get a classic job where you're paid wages and benefits. Then what kind of work do you want to do? And how can you organize your life that you can do that for yourself? That you can become an entrepreneur, or that you can gear up to be flexible enough to bounce from stint to stint to stint. When you're in the stint, it sort of feels like a job because you're getting paid wages and maybe some benefits. but it's probably not going to last very long. And so then you have to be geared up to be very flexible going forward. So that's my thinking on the future of jobs. I'll put this slide up on how to contact me, not that it's mysterious, since you can find me at futurist.com or at the Fast Coexist Future Forum site. So, Anya, thank you. I'll let you wrap it up if you want to.
Great. Well, thanks so much. This has been giving us all so much to think about, and I know that the conversation is going to continue at fastcoexist.com, where you can find the wrap-up here, and we're going to produce a post based on it, and I think that there's a lot of requests for your slides, Glenn, online, so hopefully you can find those at futurist.com. Yeah,
I'll put them up at futurist.com. I'll put them up at SlideShare and put up a blog today that says this is where they are, so people can download them download them that way. So there you go. And you guys archive this, and people can come and watch it at Fast Coexist, yes?
That's right, absolutely. Yeah, we're going to archive it at fastcoexist.com. And thank you very much. This has been really, really rewarding for me. So I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Great.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's presentation. We'd like to thank you once again for your time today, and you may now disconnect.